One of my personal favourite cartoons growing up was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Hero Turtles, depending on which part of the world you was in at the time. Turtle Mania, as it was known back then actually. Asda even started selling Turtles pizzas, and I'm sure that the Turtles actually commercialised pizza and likely had record-breaking sales. All kids wanted a slice of the action, so to speak. The cartoon itself was just awesome. The films was awesome, but let's not count part 3 with that, because that was actually pretty lame. The toys were awesome too, although Shredder was a bit strange looking, and Splinter was odd too with their material capes, which would easily get lost. Yes, I was all about Turtles back in the early 90s, and so was most kids of this era. I would cut my nan's stockings and wrap them around my face and go around pretending to be Michelangelo, to date my favourite turtle. I then discovered there was an awesome arcade game, which included all of the characters from the cartoons, from Baxter Stockman to Krang to Bebop, Rocksteady, even the robots and sewer monsters from the cartoons. This game had it all and looked so amazing on the really big CRT screens in the arcade. Whenever I went on holiday or out for the day at Seaside, I would seriously hunt down the arcade game and spend pounds on it. Apart from being a kid's dream game, the game itself was a superb beat-em-up and arguably the best beat-em-up of that era. Today we are taking a look at the worst to the best ports of the Turtles arcade game. Cowabunga, dudes. I will attempt to highlight a few good parts of the C64 1990 release. Firstly, considering the C64 being an 8-bit computer, let's face it, the game looks pretty good, and we even have the flames on stage 1, which are animated too. Control-wise, it's not actually that bad, and when hitting foot soldiers, 95% of the time, many of my hits actually counted. So Collision Texan wasn't actually 100% perfect. Music-wise, you can hear the original arcade game here, but it has its own SID chip spin on it. Sound effects are pretty much rudimentary, and that sound when a turtle dies in an arcade game is even replicated here to an extent. Now on to the not so good. So we get no introduction scenes with turtles jumping from the building to rescue April. The first stage does seem to drag on a little bit due to the slow pace of this version. The robots which emerge from the floor don't emerge here, they just scroll in from the sides of the screen. But they do give you a good electrocution animation if they do happen to electrocute you. Rocksteady just emerges rather than enter the room through his machine. We also get no Shredder grabbing April after defeating Rocksteady. You will also notice that Rocksteady's sprite is larger in the arcade version, where the C64 version, he is the same size, which doesn't give him that boss vibe, as it were. Given expected cutbacks, this isn't particularly a really bad port. It will just cause your arm to ache, as hitting action buttons tend to wear you out with this game. A true button basher version for sure. You know, some of you think I'm a little bit crazy to put the ImageWorks 1991 conversion over the Commodore 64 version. Let me explain why I think this is better. Yes, of course, the colours used here are fairly banal, but the gameplay is so much quicker and so much smoother here using the 128K Spectrum. As we could see in the C64 port previous to this one, sprites would have a slight frame issue when moving around, which sometimes made it infuriating to hit the foot soldiers. The Spectrum port, however, managed to have enemies move around with ease. Yes, there is no iconic music, and yes, there is a lack of flames in this version. Yes, April O'Neil's face looks like a gimp mask, but Rocksteady even emerges from the machine during the showdown at the end of stage 1. Okay, so it doesn't break the floor to enter the room, but it is there. Those robots even appear from the floor in this port too, although there is no cracking floor animations, but that's fine. No Shredder either, but seriously, give this Spectrum port a try. You will see for yourselves how nice it is to control. It's not too often that I will rank the Amstrad CPC arcade conversions over both Spectrum and C64, but here we are. A good feature with the CPC is its ability to provide very colourful contrast, and this is why this version looks nice and colourful. Sure, no music and sound effects which sound a little like somebody being shot with a silencer attached. Sure, April looks pretty tall in this version, but everything else seems to almost take all the best bits from the C64 and the ZX Spectrum versions and fuse it into this Amstrad release. I am pretty sure that if I was an Amstrad CPC owner back in the day, this would have really pleased me. Yes, not perfect, but in comparison to the other two 8-bit microports, this one seems to do best. Collision detection isn't so bad here either. Now, not an arcade perfect conversion, but the Atari ST port was definitely onto something here. The music was certainly a step in the right direction, even if it does sound like a semi 8-bit system. There are some great sound effects here, even when foot soldiers explode. Oddly enough, this port had a couple of soldiers crop up during the first stage, which threw bombs. Normally these would appear a little later in the game. Color palette use here is very good. And we even get an introduction sequence where the turtles jump down into the burning building. Collision detection is fairly average here. You will notice that the ST port of this suffers badly from screen scrolling frame rates. In other words, poorly coded and could have looked so much better than this. Now, oddly enough, I played two versions of this ST port, and both versions actually managed to have some kind of bug where my turtle walked up the wall and he just would not come back down to earth. In the meanwhile, I was getting electrocuted left, right, and centre. But I'm just hoping that's going to be me being unlucky. But apart from that, this is, like I say, a step in the right direction. The Commodore Amiga's conversion was a massive upgrade of the Atari ST version. Firstly, scrolling with the Amiga port is fine. It is fluid enough to have a fairly enjoyable game that looks good too. Granted, the gameplay screen is a little small compared with some other versions, but it does the job as best as the coders could do with it at the time. We also get a nice animated introduction to the game, although there doesn't appear to be any music with this version, and the sound effects are a little strange. When turtles get hit in this game, kinda sounds like an old man rather than a teenager. Colours are very decent here too, and surprisingly the fires are animated not only at the bottom of the screen but also in the distance when the doors open, when the foot soldiers emerge. The controls here are very responsive, again a big upgrade from the ST version all around really. Although we wait a few seconds to load for Rocksteady to appear at the first boss, when he does load up, we get the whole shebang, just like the arcade game. The Amiga port really isn't as bad as some arcade conversions, and definitely worth a go. Considering the rudimental sound effects, and that isn't the game's fault, that is simply because I couldn't get a better sound card working apart from the beeper. But to be honest, unless you want a very annoying loop of the same tune going over and over again in each stage, really just disable the music altogether. The sound effects with something like a Roland sound card does sound okay though. The IBM PC compatible conversion is actually pretty good. Well, at least the better version out of the 8 and 16-bit computer versions. As you see in the gameplay footage, it's relatively fast paced with no frame issues when scrolling. Hit collision detection is really good here too. Color wise, depending on the video output, this was actually captured using EGA mode, which looks pretty good and nice and colourful. Similar to the arcade game, we also get Rocksteady arriving by his machine here, although no Shredder sprite which kidnaps April. We also get a great introduction to this version too. Considering many DOS arcade conversions have generally been pretty rough, the arcade game of the Turtles is pretty spot on. Nice animation of flames too. So yeah, again, apart from the music, this is a really solid version which needs a little more attention to it. It's really not that bad. It was pretty inevitable which home port was going to get first spot here, let's be honest. This is the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom by Ultra Games if you were in the States for its release, or in Japan and Europe we had it published by Konami. A monumental release for 1991, and damn, I was over the moon to have this game for my NES back in the day. You will see me holding it next to Double Dragon 2 and DuckTales for around my 11th birthday. Yes, I was a big Count Duckula fan too back then. Anyways, what makes this NES game so spectacular? Yes, the sprites are smaller and it looks like it's an 8-bit game, which it obviously is, just a little better, but it plays so well, looks so good, and even includes some extra stages too. As a kid, I was chuffed with the extra snow stage and its new bosses, which obviously weren't in the original arcades game. Every so many foot soldiers you kill gives the player an extra life, or rest as it calls it in the game. April O'Neil is even animated slightly in this NES port. Rocksteady arrives in true arcade style, and he even changes colours when you are getting close to defeating him. Shredder kidnaps April. The scrolling collision detection is 100% spot on without a doubt. Truly, this is the best version out there next to the arcade original. In fact, this port is worth playing just as much as the arcades game for those extra added stages alone. Such a great version, and it's still awesome to play to date. So that's it for ranking the Turtles arcade games today. So which version did you grow up with, and which version did you actually like best? Do you agree that the Nintendo NES port deserved to be in top place? So let me know in the comments. Anyways, as always, thanks for watching. Robocop was as iconic to the 1980s as the Rubik's Cube was, arguably one of the most violent films made of the decade, which is even more graphic should you watch the director's cut. One of my favourite films of all time, Paul Verhoeven delivered us a science fiction action-packed masterpiece set in the world of crime, corruption and corporate greed. The idea was very simple: build a new Detroit or Delta City, pretty much ignoring the crime spree happening in the background. Alex Murphy is on duty with his partner Lewis. He is subsequently murdered, and so Omni Consumer Products, or OCP, takes over the police department to tackle crime. Thus, Robocop is built, part human and part machine. The film goes deeper in this with hilarious news reports from Media Break with some of the most ridiculous stories, which helps construct the Robocop universe. I love this film so much that I actually once wrote an essay for university through its postmodern theme. Truly an excellent film that I loved to watch growing up. So, on with the arcades game, a running gun affair that was arguably one of the arcade's best in this genre. And inevitably, we have several ports. Today we are ranking each port from bad to best. Can you fly, Bobby? As much as the 1989 Commodore 64 Robocop game by Ocean was good, and it is one that I did play growing up, let's just be honest, the utter disgrace of Ocean putting out a game which was essentially broken was pretty shameful. Even if you hadn't played the C64 port, you make it into the game a few stages where you get to the drug factory, and this is where the fun ends. You cannot get past this stage. The timer ticks away, and as a kid, I'd wonder how the hell to get past this. You couldn't. There was literally a wall blocking the way to proceed any further into the game. Thankfully, just over 10 years back, somebody in the C64 community reworked it and made it doable, as well as taking away the remaining stages which were in a poor state, and they actually made the game fully playable from start to finish. It is a shame because the gameplay, although ridiculously hard in this version, and its presentation is top notch, and the music produced by Jonathan Dunn is some of the C64's best out there, especially the captivating starting screen music, just awesome. A will briefly mention this diabolical 1988 conversion just here for the TRS-80 or Tandy color computer. To those who haven't seen this godforsaken mess, the next video in this list is pretty much identical but upgraded to an extent. One thing to mention with this port is that after Robocop defeats the first boss of the first stage, which today I am still unaware of who this actually is, he says, "Thank you for your cooperation." Problem is, this actually sounds a little bit more like Kevin McAllister's Talkboy in slow motion from Home Alone. The music, although sounds like the Robocop tune, this version is just too much for this dated computer at this point. Firstly, let's get this out the way. This isn't a particularly great game, neither does it follow the original arcade game, but this is old school Nintendo, and they always liked to be different back in the day. The NES version is another version of Robocop I would play growing up. Was I particularly a fan of it back then? Well, no, not really. I liked playing it because it was Robocop, and that's about it. So what is wrong with this 1989 8-bit console port? Well, if you have watched the original films, you will find at no point does there appear to be kids attacking Robocop who are wearing what appears to be brown berets. You will find no futuristic looking helicopter shooting down at Robocop from the sky, and Robocop didn't appear to have any form of malfunction when walking up and down stairways. And let's just remember that walking up and down stairs in the NES version is just a pain. I don't recall any dogs attacking him endlessly either. The only part of this NES port which closely resembles the film is taking down the mayor and punching the wall to get to him. It's not even the most stunning looking NES game either, I don't think. It's very likely that the creator of this version just wanted to do a big upgrade around the TRS-80 version, which was actually released a year prior to this port. This 1988 Apple II conversion by Data East, although a little on the laggy side, isn't really a bad port. Let's remember that this port is running from technically a 1970s computer, and so 11 years on for publishers to be still producing for this 8-bit system was really an achievement in itself. So then, the game obviously isn't a multi-scrolling version and sticks with single screen, which was likely done to help the game perform better. For what it is an 8-bit machine, I think this version looks fairly good and it tries its best to remain faithful to the arcade version, whereas other versions was a little bit different. For example, after destroying Eds 209 here, we move on to the next stage where Robocop is met with enemies with chainsaws. This didn't happen in most versions of Robocop games. Is this a good port? Well, like I say, considering the very aged hardware, specifically around 1977, it would be an awful thing to criticize this port. I think it's a decent game which just suffers from frame drops, if anything. The IBM PC compatible version of Robocop looks nice, although let's be honest, Robocop is fighting in a rundown old Detroit, and so technically it shouldn't look as colourful as something along the lines of Super Mario Brothers, but that's just the way it was for this 1988 conversion. Now, firstly, let's discuss the awful beeper music for this. Yes, it is ear-piercing stuff, and just like most other DOS games of this era, the music is very often drowned out by the ear-piercing sound effects, which isn't a great combination. It doesn't particularly control too well either, and it's fairly smooth multi-scrolling game, and collision detection is fairly good too. Eds 209 doesn't actually look too bad either at the end of the first stage. The MSX conversion is following the typical 8-bit computer formula. Sadly, this port is much like the ZX Spectrum conversion, but for the wrong reasons. This is a fairly bad game to control. As you can see in the footage here, the game struggles to even multi-scroll. Just not a good port. We will take a look at the Spectrum version soon though. The original Game Boy conversion is going for a more 8-bit approach in terms of the game's layout. It totally avoids the NES version, which released a year prior to this 1990 release, which isn't really a bad thing at all, as like I say, I was never too keen on the NES or the TRS-80 versions. There isn't really much wrong with this portable version at all, but there is yet better to come in this video, and by far this is much better than the previous conversions we have looked at so far. I would have been very happy with this version on my Game Boy as a kid, but I never actually owned this one back then. Truly a fantastic port of Robocop for the ZX Spectrum, very likely one of the best games to come out on the ZX Spectrum 2, and goes down as an all-time favourite amongst Speccy fans. Impressively, we have voice synth here in this version, as well as music and sound effects both together. It is so smooth to play regardless of how much is going on at the same time during gameplay, very smooth. I played this via Kempston joystick and it works fabulously. Sure, monochrome is the main style of this version on the Spectrum, but this port doesn't overly feel messy with colour clash going on. The whole monochrome look really isn't bad at all for the Robocop port. Impressively, I found that even the alleyway stage whilst taking down the thug was so nicely put together, and even that just seemed better than the C64 version too. The characters in games such as Robocop and the enemies were really nicely animated in the Spectrum version. From the music and pre-game BIOS presentation before you start Stage 1, the Amstrad CPC conversion was, in my opinion, the best of the main 8-bit computers of the time. As you will see in the footage, it is nice and colourful, but not as colourful as something like the DOS conversion. This version's colours are a little deeper in colours, and it's not so bright as some other versions. It is a smooth and very responsive experience, and not quite as challenging as, say, the C64 version, but still very hard at times. Collision detection is spot on here too. This is a rare ranking for me where I find that an Amstrad port gets a higher place than both C64 and Spectrum. But in this case, Robocop on the CPC truly deserved to be here. Oh, and did I mention this version even has voice synth too? The Atari ST conversion looks and plays fairly well. We have some excellent voice synth here too, which kind of sounds a lot like Robocop. There isn't much wrong with this port at all. Everything functions well, apart from a slight bit of lag here and there. But come on, we have seen much worse than this. Remember yesterday's Turtles coin-up ST conversion? One thing that I don't much like is that this and the next version has that bezel going around the gameplay screen, but that's just being a little bit nitpicky.
Serve the public trust. Protect the innocent.
And at first place, I've ranked the Commodore Amiga version. Firstly, it's very similar to the ST conversion. Only noticeable difference is really two factors. The Amiga port had a bigger gameplay screen, and it seemed very much nicer to play, and seemed a little smoother compared to the Atari ST counterpart. Some really nice voice synth that emulates Robocop's sound. Colours used here are pretty much on par with the ST conversion. I have ranked both of these higher than the 8-bit computer conversions, as firstly, sprites are obviously much bigger and truer to the arcade original. Although the Amstrad had voice synth too, that was very limited. With the 16-bit computer ports, we have voice pretty much throughout. Can you just imagine how awesome this would have been at the time? I will also have to say that the shooting gallery in between levels on the Amiga port just seems so awesome too. So that's it for today's ranking the Robocop ports. So a really strange mixture here, but we got there in the end. So what do you think of my rankings? Which version of Robocop did you grow up with? Let me know in the comments which your favourite version was and why is that. Firstly, let me explain a few things about Wonder Boy. We have the original arcades game released way back in 1986 by Sega, and we have other versions where it is known as Adventure Island, but theoretically the same game. I will discuss that when we get to it. We also have games which won't be here in this ranking, such as Wonder Boy and Monsterland, or Super Wonder Boy and Monsterland, as these are all sequels which went down an RPG route with Wonder Boy. We also have various different sequels to the original game, such as Wonder Boy IV, all of them being very different. We are strictly looking at the 1986 arcade classic that most kids and adults had a copy of back in the 80s. A simple game of reaching the end of the stage before the timer runs out and collecting fruit, which increases the timer. There are 4 rounds in each world in Wonder Boy. At the end of the last stage, an ogre awaits. After defeating it, we then go back to stage 1 to 4 again, which are pretty much the same as before, but with increased difficulty and more baddies to defeat. A game I played in the arcade as a kid and played relentlessly on my C64 back in the day. So from worst to best, here is the various home ports of Wonder Boy ranked as requested by many people here. All I am going to say that Wonder Boy isn't wandering anywhere too quickly in this shoddy Amstrad CPC conversion by Activision, which released back in 1987. Something I praise the Amstrad with a lot is the ability to produce contrasty colours, very bright colours in other words. Now you might have thought that given the source material is a fairly bright game, that Amstrad could pull this off, but no, this version has very dull colours and looks kind of depressing. The game is frankly boring to play with its terrible frame rate. Even when I hopped onto skateboards to pick up some speed, I hoped it would. No, it didn't, and I actually thought that what was the point in adding a skateboard if Wonder Boy travels at the same pace? 8-bit chip music sounds average and also includes sound effects, but there are times when extra music should have been added. For example, when smashing an egg for the invincibility fairy, no music here for that. And going back to the poor frame rates, sprites flicker really badly too with this port. Although this Japanese 1986 conversion direct from Sega came out a year prior to the Amstrad conversion, this is leap years ahead. Yes, the layout of the stages are a little strange to what you're normally used to, and instead of confronting the ogre at the end of say round 4, we fight him at the end of round 1. The game actually looks vibrant, and it even has a unique tune for the background music, which is actually pretty damn catchy if I'm honest. The Sega SG-1000 version is choppy as you can see, but this version is at least playable and didn't feel depressing whilst playing it. Control wise it's very good too. It's not perfect by any means, but like I say, a huge leap from the trashy previous Amstrad CPC conversion. Okay, so Wonder Boy looks like he has eaten too many burgers in the Spectrum's version, but it is faithful to the arcade original given its hardware capabilities, and to some degree it's fairly playable. Again, is it perfect? Well, not really, but by far it is better than the Amstrad CPC's conversion, and although a little bit choppy, it's much more playable for sure. Nice Spectrum music with this game, and the sound effects are good too, and good responsive controls. Not a bad port at all for the ZX Spectrum. Just like another version in this video, this MSX conversion goes by the name of Adventure Island. As you will hear in the background, the music is directly from the arcades game, which actually sounds pretty good for the MSX. The only difference is with this version is the change of character, as I will explain why this is a little later. Considering many MSX conversions can be often placed much lower down in my videos, I think this does a fairly decent job considering. Okay, so scrolling isn't perfect, but if you have seen some of my other videos to see how bad MSX handles scrolling in some games, you will see why this is actually a pretty good version. Sprite control is really responsive and its use of colour palette is really nice here too. Of course we have sprites here with backgrounds being exposed through their bodies, but not necessarily a big deal breaker. It's a really good port to play, I recommend this one. Despite the name of this game being Adventure Island, this NES game is pretty much Wonder Boy. I won't go into licensing issues, but briefly, Sega owns the name Wonder Boy and the character, and so the NES version had to change its name, and that's why the sprite or the character that we control looks different here compared with the other versions. But yes, the game is Wonder Boy through and through. So is it any good? Yes, absolutely perfect. The music is different from the arcade game, but again, likely this was down to legalities, and of course Sega clung to its icons back in those days too. The scrolling is fast, no frame rate issues at all. Adventure Island has very tight controls, and frankly, it was a really joyful port of Wonder Boy to play. Difficulty wise, this is up there. Each port generally messes around with enemy sprites and where fruit is placed in the game. This version is no exception. Totally decent port and cannot rank it any further because we are actually hunting for the next best thing to the arcade original. If it wasn't for the sprite changes and music change, this would have likely ranked in top spot. Easily by comparing all of the 8-bit home computer versions of Wonder Boy, the Commodore 64 version beats them in terms of colour, music, sound effects, scrolling and collision detection. This really is the perfect 8-bit computer port. This is the version I had as a kid. I specifically had it on the Hit Squad label. I have fond memories of playing this more often than my other C64 games. I actually broke my joystick one Saturday morning whilst playing stage 2 on this. I yanked my joystick and snapped it. Needless to say, I wasn't a happy boy at all that Saturday morning, and to be fair, it was some cheater joystick anyways. My dad went out to get me a new one that day, otherwise mum and dad likely wouldn't have heard the end of it. Anyways, no bias here, I try and assess everything I cover per port, but I am pretty confident most will agree with me on this choice. If you had a Sega Game Gear back in the day and you wanted to annoy somebody with the Game Gear versus Game Boy scenario, this was a game to do it with for sure. This is the best of the best and likely the closest to the arcade game you will get. The game looks wonderful here, as well as music and the sound effects. I always thought that the cover art was a little sinister for the Game Gear version, though. Very strange stuff. And in first place, I am ranking the Sega Master System conversion, which released back in 1987. Virtually the same version as the Sega Game Gear's port. What makes this better than the Game Gear port then? Well, what can I say? The Sega Master System hooked up to a TV and that's about it. The game plays just as well, sounds awesome with its near arcade sounding music and sound effects. It's a cheerful and very colourful conversion with amazing scrolling screens which flow fairly well. There is a slight bit of frame rate delay every now and again, but nothing significant. But that is a consequence of home computer and console conversions back in the day. Not everything was 100% to perfection like it would be in today's world. I never owned this version back in the day on my Sega Master System, but know for a fact I would likely prefer this over the really cool Commodore 64 port. Truly a great attempt to bring in Wonder Boy into the homes at the time of its release. And that's it for today's ranking Wonder Boy ports. This one's been requested over and over again, and I thought I would release it just before Christmas, so at least you can see one of your favourite games being compared. So let me know in the comments which your favourite version of Wonder Boy was, and please, before you comment, just be mindful that this is a very confusing history of Wonder Boy. It's not as simple as something like Streets of Rage. It's been called various different names over the years, it's got various different sequels, and yeah, it's very confusing. But anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. By popular request, we are taking a look today at the various ports of the classic 1987 light gun rail shooter that is Operation Wolf. Now, firstly, I have made this video a little bit different from the usual format that I use. There are a few different systems that had this game ported, but these systems are either slightly different or doesn't provide us with the full Operation Wolf experience. Notably, the panel on the right hand side of the screen is missing, and some versions also display this game in full screen format, whereas I found this a little bit difficult to fit these in with everything else in this video. After all, the point of these arcade port videos is to weed out the closest and most authentic to the original arcades game, and with these systems this was particularly problematic. I will rank these few different versions last, but firstly we'll go through the ports which attempted to look and play just like the arcade original game. I will also note here that the MSX had an aftermarket conversion, but like in all of my videos in this series, we are solely focusing on the original releases during these systems' commercial years. Although the Amstrad CPC 1988 conversion by Ocean is a really good effort for this game, I did find that it was just too fast. Now, I know that Linford Christie was iconic in the 1980s, but really, did he need to be in this game as a soldier you are controlling? Sadly, many games for the Amstrad CPC had a smaller gameplay screen, and this was one of them. It's not a massive issue because kids could wear glasses in 1988 too. Jokes aside, this is a decent enough port, but yeah, two main factors are its fast pace and smaller gameplay screen. Hit collision detection is actually spot on here by the seams bit, although I did find controlling the crosshair did appear to be a little bit stiff with this port occasionally. All in all, definitely not particularly a really bad awful port, but a damn sight better than yesterday's Wonderboy Amstrad's conversion. Most people likely would have been very satisfied with this game back in the day. You know, when I come across ZX Spectrum arcade ports which play so amazingly, a little smile crops up on my face, knowing that higher spec hardware was around at this point of release that did a much poorer job of much better hardware too. If you can tolerate the monochrome colours, Operation Wolf on the spec key is awesome in comparison with the Amstrad version. There was absolutely no controller issues with this version, and to note, I was actually using the Sinclair joystick for this and not a Kempston for a change. Collision detection was pretty smack on with this too. Its scrolling was just about right too and didn't feel too fast. This was the 128K version I was playing here. 1988 was a decent year for Spectrum users. The Commodore 64 version is actually fairly good. At this point, I cannot actually believe that Ocean Software produced 3 of the main 8-bit computers, which were actually decent. The game opens up with its authentic arcade opening, where the screen scrolls before the gameplay actually starts. Now, my only beef really with this version is the crosshair. As you will see in the gameplay footage, the crosshair is nice and visible until you start shooting. You will then easily lose where you are when you're trying to aim or aim at a soldier, and it disappears once you start shooting, and it's just not easy to judge. Nice colours used, not overly bright but kind of dull, but let's be fair, it is a war zone, so it's not likely going to be all sparkling. Scrolling is spot on here with no slowdowns, and collision detection appears to be fairly good here too. Sprites are a little chunky, but that's the Commodore 64 for you. Overall, a fairly decent 8-bit home computer port. The issue with the Atari ST port of Operation Wolf is its slow frame rates. I mentioned earlier that some ZX Spectrum games can perform better than higher end systems, and this is a good example of that. Animations, backgrounds look great and the sound is excellent too, but it's just not much fun to play due to the extreme pacing of this version. There is much better to come, but let's just stay focused here that the sprites in the Atari ST version are almost spot on with the arcade original, and of course a lot bigger than those micro 8-bit versions. The IBM PC compatible DOS port is very good. It is slightly on the choppy side when sprites are moving, but definitely not as bad as some other DOS conversions that I have covered on these port videos so far. And of course this is much more superior in terms of performance compared with the Atari ST version. The scrolling screen isn't an issue, the crosshair is also fairly tidy here with nice hit detection collision. A more dull colour approach has been used with this port. Taito released this back in 1989 and it really isn't that bad at all. Definitely up there as one of the best DOS arcade conversions. It even has the intro where a soldier parachutes downwards and also shows us the operation map before the game starts. So in first place for a most convincing and most authentic looking port of Operation Wolf, I'm choosing the Commodore Amiga. I think that the Commodore Amiga Ocean conversion firstly would have worn the hell out of a lot of tank mouses with this release back in the day. It is almost similar to the DOS conversion, but of course plays so much nicer and looks slightly better too. And of course the music sounds much more authentic to the arcades game. And that is what you get for being a Commodore fan back in the day. Mainly awesomeness, that is. This is a fairly hard port, very difficult that is. I found myself dying a ridiculous amount of times with this version. Again, we are going for that more dull look with the colour palette here. It plays really nicely and scrolls nicely too. Granted, sprites on screen do have a slight bit of lag when they're moving around, but definitely not as bad as the DOS version. This is totally playable and I would have loved this version back in the day. So that's it for the most authentic looking port. So next section of this is going to be moving on to those last remaining versions of this game which weren't too great, but we're going to rank those anyways. Let's be honest, did this Nintendo NES 1989 port by Taito really deserve to go any higher? There was just way too much playing field and not enough really happening in terms of killing soldiers and blowing up tanks. It is fairly ugly too for a Nintendo NES game. The gameplay is pretty dull, and to be honest, as a kid back then, I think I would prefer to play Duck Hunt. I think by taking away the panel on the right hand side which displays the ammo and the grenades you've got, this version kind of gives far too much playing area which is pointless when it's not being utilised. Very similar to the NES conversion, although this is an improvement in terms of the colour palette used and the sound. The colours with the Sega Master System are of course much darker, and I think that it looks that much better for doing this too. In terms of sound, the NES version just sounded utterly pitiful. Example, when shooting at a helicopter in the NES version, it kind of sounded very strange. Whereas here in the Sega Master System conversion, in terms of 8-bit sound production, it actually sounds that much better. Controller wise, this is pretty good, although with all these ports I have not been using a light gun. One issue with the Sega Master System version is of course, just like other versions in this section of the video, it is totally removing the whole look of Operation Wolf with the side panel or right hand screen removed. We do have it at the bottom, but still just doesn't look quite right. We'll also comment here that sprites or tiles do flicker a fair amount here in this Master System version. Although the format of the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 conversion changes from every version in terms of scoring right rather than left in Mission 1, and this port also denies that side panel from being on the right hand side, this is a much tidier and cleaner version in terms of how it looks. Something very strange with this port is that the stage menu before the game begins generally has 6 stages on display, whereas here we only have 4. A nice feature of this game though is that we actually have the ability to change the speed of how fast the game plays. Like I say, this version scrolls to the right, and although the gameplay looks familiar, the layout is very different from the others in terms of the army barracks and watchtower placements, and even enemies who are shooting at you. They've actually added an addition of a soldier in here with a bulletproof armor who will literally take a grenade to kill off. Overly, not a bad port, but just like others in this section of the video, it is very different. I personally see the FM Towns port as an upgrade from the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 conversion. Again, this version scrolls right and also displays just a few missions. A strange and very noticeable addition to this game is randomly we see a young lady ducking for cover whilst only dressed in red underwear. So I'm not quite sure what that was about, but let's just say it's a Rambo thing, just like Operation Wolf is pretty much based around that type of genre of film. The quality over the PC Engine version is obviously much more improved here and generally better in terms of its sound production and gameplay. One feature that does to some degree remain faithful to the source material is the ammo panel actually being displayed on the right hand side here. Okay, so not much like the arcade version, but at least the developers attempted to keep this in mind and keep it to some extent faithful to the arcade original game. And that's it for today's ranking of various different ports of Operation Wolf. So like I said at the start of the video, this is a very unusual way for me to rank these videos, but given the differences of the last section of this video, I hope that you can understand why I did it round this way. But anyways, let us know in the comments which your favourite port of Operation Wolf was on your home computer or home console, and did you actually play this in the arcade? I personally remember seeing this in the arcades, but I was too young and little at the time to actually reach up to grab those machine guns mounted onto the arcade machine. But anyways, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care. So by popular request today we are going through the worst to best arcade conversions of Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja. I always call this game Dragon Ninja personally, a little bit of a mouthful to say everything in one go. This awesome side-scrolling beat-em-up comes with a fairly generic story where President Ronnie is kidnapped, very clearly named after Ronald Reagan, who was the American president at the time of this game's release. Maybe the ninjas didn't think much of his Reaganomics, who knows. In the game we play as a bad dude and take on ninjas as we travel from New York to truck top fights and beyond. Totally 1980s action-packed style. A game that I had on my Commodore 64 and Nintendo NES back in the day. I had the Commodore 64 version on the Hit Squad label, and it was a game on the C64 that I played a lot of. It even featured in one of my favourite Steve Martin films, which was Parenthood. Classic stuff. So anyways, let's take on those ports as always and see which I personally regard as the most faithful game to the original Data East 1988 arcade game. Now this game should have been titled Bad Apples, as in this is bad, and I don't mean that in a good way either. This pitiful Quicksilver release for the Apple II computers is the miniature version of Bad Dudes, which suffers from insane difficulty like you wouldn't believe. I must have had 10 attempts with this trying to get to the first boss. Needless to say, I just gave up and called it a night. Why is this version so difficult? I honestly have no idea. A possibility is that the game wasn't finished and so made it extremely difficult, hoping that kids would never notice. Now, like I always say with Apple II games, this is a 1977 computer, with this release being in 1989. I will always say then that the audience was still there for this dated machine back in 1989, obviously. This is the very bare basics of the game, features no music and doesn't multi-scroll, which is common for Apple II ports. Just look at Robocop I uploaded the other day. Regardless, surely this system wasn't up for the task. I am confident that this is Apple II's version of Dark Souls. Very challenging stuff. We are now entering ZX Spectrum Monochrome Gaming. Okay, so where do I start with this? Not necessarily a bad conversion by Ocean, but sometimes, most of the time, 8-bit microcomputers do need to chill out and face the fact that not everything will be included in home conversions. And of course, the Spectrum is no exception here. It controls well enough for sure. I did find collision detection to be a little sporadic at times, especially on the first boss. No music, just sound effects. But to be fair, before the game begins, we have actually got a fair introduction music piece blasting out of the 128K model. No truck midway into stage 1, but I was actually surprised to see that stage 2 performed fairly decently. A fully scrolling stage on top of the truck, that is. No cars dropping off ninja, so something noticeable here is that the coder didn't want to add Data East on the lorry. Instead, we see Ocean. Wow, what a set out. The IBM PC compatible DOS conversion actually isn't as bad as I thought it might be. Is it much like the arcades game? Well, yes, it's certainly recognisable at least. It controls fairly well, playing it through as a one player, and oddly enough, the beeper sounds really aren't that bad here. Still terrible, of course, but for an 8-ish DOS game, this doesn't drive a man insane, surprisingly. Visually, it looks like a DOS game for sure, and I was a little annoyed of how midway into the first stage that the truck that drives in is actually missing here. As a kid, looking at this game in magazines always portrayed every version of it as having that truck, and it actually wasn't here with the DOS version. Proper action stuff going on for sure. We also had to wait for the disc to load before we get to the first boss. Not really a bad conversion of Bad Dudes, just not great compared with the other releases to come. This is the version I used to play when I was a kid, and good lord, I didn't appreciate how difficult this was. And fair play to myself for actually beating this C64 conversion once. Now, this was a tough decision between this platform and the next platform. Why? Well, because personally, although the music by Jonathan Dunn is pretty damn good, we are looking for the next thing to the arcade version. As I always say, and this music wasn't in the arcade original. We also see no truck driving through. On the plus side, we of course get a full screen here, and it really does look the part too with its colours used. Second stage in, we also get no cars, which is dropping off ninjas to fight you on top of the truck. Really though, as great as this port is compared with others, this is a type of game which earned all the games a reputation of being hard as nails. A fairly decent 1989 Ocean version for Amstrad CPC owners. If you had a 128K Amstrad model, you would have even had voice synth, to which admittedly sounds almost similar to the arcade game. The game itself scrolls really nicely, fairly good collision detection, and sprites don't give us any flickering when too much is happening on the screen at once. No music, but some sound effects that sounds pretty good. I was happy to see my truck ride through this version too. I love the use of colours here, although a little bit too bright, but that's what Amstrad does with its games. I also found that scrolling was pretty good too during stage 2. Impressive stuff all around, but again, annoyingly, we are limited to the smaller gameplay screen here. This was dependent on the modes that the programmer worked with, of course. Different Amstrad modes gave us different looks. Nevertheless, a really nice port which many would have been happy with back in the day. I remember buying this for my NES back in the day from a selling newspaper, as it were, known as Trade It, a West Country selling paper that is. Good lord, that paper was awesome, and there were a good way there to buy some second-hand games for a really good price. Anyways, I wasn't overly impressed with this version, but playing it again after all these years, I can say that it isn't actually that bad. Music is a nice NES rendition of the arcade music. I do find that the sprites have a strange way of moving in this part, almost like there's a second sprite moving slightly behind them. It's also a fairly tough version of Bad Dudes 2. Nice sound effects and even throws in some voice synth too, which I'd totally forgotten about. Sprites weren't as large as the arcade version, and there is a fair amount of flicker going on here. Like I say, I was thinking I might see the truck make an appearance, but with this 1989 Data East conversion, it was already parked, and I didn't get to see it drive by. The second stage looks fairly nice, but sadly, no cars were here, which was transporting ninjas. Overall, a fairly average NES side-scrolling beat-em-up game. The Atari ST conversion is a fairly faithful port, a little slow to play, but good to an extent. It certainly looks the part with larger sprites than previous versions we've looked at so far. The music and sound effects are okay, but the next conversion in this video is much better. It's fairly good to control, and goddammit, no truck rolling into the first stage with this version either. The magazines back in the day made it seem that this was a thing for each version. Really? Did the magazines lie to us? Nah, they wouldn't do that to kids, would they now? Really though, one of the things I was looking forward to was that moment in each version where it actually only happens in one conversion so far, which was the CPC. One thing that stands out with the SD version is that light grey border, but that's not the end of the world. It's a fairly good port, just a little slow. And in first place, I put the Commodore Amiga conversion, which also released back in 1988. It's a fairly solid conversion. The music compared with other versions, for a start, is more authentic to the original sound, and also the sound effects are pretty much smack on here too. It does play a tiny bit fast, but that could be down to WinUA that I was using. Although I did set this as a stock Amiga 500 model, and having looked at other gameplays of this Amiga port, they all pretty much look the same. I am thinking that this is how it actually looked originally back on release in the late 80s. This conversion plays really well and is very responsive to controls. I actually love the music here, and dare I say it, I think it's an upgrade from the arcades version. Color wise isn't too bad compared with some other versions here. Collision detection is also pretty spot on here too. Sadly, no truck, and just like a couple of other conversions, we also had to wait a few seconds for the boss to load in. Second stage also looks really nice with nice consistent multi-scrolling action, which doesn't appear to lag. So that's it for my ranking Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja ports today. So which version did you grow up with? Are you like me and got brought up with the Commodore 64 conversion? Which version would you have put in first place? Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. Just before Christmas, I ran a community vote and asked which arcade ports video you want to see next. This is it. This is the original 1987 Street Fighter by Capcom. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this first release, you'll notice that it's fairly bare bones to the sequel Street Fighter 2, which I've also covered in this series. We play as one character in this game and compete against various other fighters with different countries as backdrops. In terms of special moves, this game was one of the first fighting games to feature this edition. Scrolling with the original release isn't as smooth and refined as Street Fighter 2 of course, and life does deplete fairly quickly in this very challenging game too. So anyways, today we are ranking every port of this game, home computer versions largely published by US Gold and developed by Teratex. I will note that any aftermarket releases such as the Sam Coupe release will not be included. This video will solely focus on commercial year's releases. Collections for consoles will also not be mentioned because largely these are actually emulated releases, and I'll warn you now that this is likely the worst bunch of ports I've ever reviewed in this series. Okay, so to kick things off, we're starting with the C64 UK release. So this is obviously the UK version of Street Fighter. So where do I start? Let's start with a positive. The music is average for a C64 game, nothing to boast about. This is where the positives actually stop. Firstly, you'll notice the overly distorted sprites here, ugly for sure, and they seem to be from another game entirely. Looks like somebody designed the backdrops and somebody placed these sprites in place, and it just doesn't seem to match. Even the intro to fights is plastered with ugly, overpixelated pictures of the fighters. Does it control well? No, it really doesn't. Pulling off special moves here is sporadic, and you just really hope for the best with this version. The C64 re-release of this game actually came with the USA version on side B of the cassette tape, almost like they knew the British version was that awful. We can't even choose where we want to fight here like most other versions, we just get placed where the computer wants us to fight. Like I mentioned in the intro, life depletes very quickly in the arcade game. My first fight here was just like that, but much worse. Like several versions to appear in this video, fighters don't have their own backdrops, but tends to reuse particular ones over and over again. I did actually find that sometimes the opponents do sometimes appear to have a bug where you can actually beat them easily if they're in the right position when they just stand still. If you were very unfortunate to have the British version of this and was thinking the sequel would be much better a few years down the line, you seriously have my sympathy. The IBM PC compatible release lacked two essential features to make this more of an arcade experience. One, music would have been nice, and secondly, a game where hit detection would actually count. I fought several opponents with this DOS release. As I was hitting each opponent, I realised that my punches and kicks barely took anything away from the opponent's health bar. I did attempt to pull off some special moves here, but was unlucky. Of course, as to be expected, the sound effects with the DOS version wasn't particularly anything spectacular. On the plus side, I did find that the sprite design and backdrops were fairly nice here compared with other versions, although slightly pixelated. It's not a bad port, it's just a shame about the extreme difficulty level here. Oddly enough, Capcom published this version and would have thought that an issue like this would have been addressed prior to its release back in 1988. You'll also notice that for some reason the DOS conversion sprites were the smallest in all ports in this video. In terms of presentation, the Commodore Amiga conversion looked promising, but I have been there and done this before and will say now, the looks are seriously where it ends. Although like many more conversions, you'll see for this game that the difficulty level isn't as bad as some. The main issue with this Amiga game is its severe lag. It features severe input delay too. For an Amiga game, there is little features that are missing here. A higher end computer compared to 8-bit computers could have at least added some moving clouds to make it look a little bit more authentic to what it's trying to imitate. But nope, we don't even get that here with the Amiga version. Just like the MS-DOS version, this version also features 4 countries to choose from, although it is pointless because this game is just hands down diabolical. Going back to presentation, it does look faithful in a way, but for an Amiga game, the colour palette is very dull. It's just a very embarrassing conversion on a decent 16-bit computer. Shame on you, Teratex. next up we got the Atari ST conversion. So this one is pretty much similar to the Amiga version, but not much better. Although the coders did decide to animate the clouds in this Atari ST version, it is slightly less laggy than the Amiga's conversion too. I will stress here that by no means is this port actually any good. Literally, the clouds and a fraction of less lag is how the Atari ST port got into a higher position in this video. This ZX Spectrum release wasn't a bad port compared with the previous versions. Much like other platforms, Street Fighter's difficulty levels were largely extreme to the point where almost impossible to beat other fighters. Firstly, although slightly easier with depleting enemies' life, although not really that much easier, this game is a tiny bit more playable with the fact that you're actually getting somewhere, although not too far. For those new to Spectrum games, this monochrome look isn't anything out of the ordinary. This is how most Spectrum games looked. Scrolling wise is fairly good here, sprites move around just fine, and we can actually see which moves they're pulling off, even the screen moves from side to side, where many other versions just stayed static. Is this really a good game though? No, not at all. Not much of an upgrade so far, but we'll just say at least this Amstrad CPC conversion had colour compared with the Spectrums. Difficulty level with this port was slightly easier than the Spectrum and DOS versions, but good lord, this game is far from playable because of the Fury and Radio encounter where, just like most other versions, collision detection is that bad when hitting, and when you do manage to get a hit, it just doesn't seem to count for much on their energy bars. No music here, just sound effects, which are average for an 8-bit Amstrad game. As I say, it does feature colours, but it's far from anything groundbreaking really. Generally, Amstrad CPC games look nice and colourful, but not this game. It just seems to love itself only for the sheer level of toughness. In comparison to the pitiful UK conversion for the Commodore 64, this American version wasn't actually that bad. The character sprites here are pretty top notch and intricately detailed too. The backdrops are much nicer and offering better colours too with this American port. Fighting opponents actually feels like you are getting somewhere and you can see the moves rather than just seeing a load of blocky pixel mess like the British version had. When this game loads up, it feels a little bit more authentic to what it is porting across. A nice presentation screen introduction, and we even have the ability to change difficulty modes here. It controls really nicely, the characters even come into the stages walking along before the fight begins, just like the arcade version. Kind of looks like you are jumping up and down, a bit like a kangaroo, but that's cool because that's how the arcade game looked. In terms of music, a massive improvement throughout. Yes, we do get to share backdrops here rather than each player having their own, but that's a sacrifice that some microcomputer ports had to make back in the day. And at top place in this video, I've ranked the PC Engine CD or the TurboGrafx 16 CD port. This version is actually known as Fighting Street, but it's essentially the same game. So what makes this a winner? We pretty much have the full package here. Music and sound effects are fairly close to emulating the sound of the 1987 Capcom arcade game, and it also offers a fair challenge, which is almost on par with the arcade game. So in other words, this game is playable unlike the extreme difficulty levels of most of the ports. Music production here is actually more of an enhancement over the source material. There's a slight echo when hitting opponents in this game, and it kind of sounds pretty cool. Talking about hitting, this is likely also the only version where hit collision detection is accurate too. Most other ports were really sketchy with collision detection. Controller wise, this had no input lag and plays much like the original arcade game. Out of most of these ports in this video I've showcased, they were largely produced by the infamous Tiratex. This version wasn't. and I don't really need to say any more just here. This was developed by NEC Avenue for North America release and Hudson Soft for Japan in 1988, who even included voice synth too with the PC Engine CD version. And that's it for today's ranking the Street Fighter port. So like I mentioned in the introduction, there truly was some shocking games to play just here, probably the worst I've ever done. But drop us a line in the comments and let us know which version you played as a kid. Did you like it or hate it? What was it? Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching. Renegade, a solid arcade 1986 beat-em-up classic by Taito. Solid as in this game was designed to eat your money very quickly and leave you crying and run into your mum for more money. Partly inspired by Bruce Lee and using the aesthetic of the 1979 classic Warriors film, this is a damn challenging game. If you haven't played before, you had to take on the entire gang and then the boss with just one single chance each time at this. The game predates Double Dragon by around a year, although both were actually developed by Technos Japan. Renegade certainly took beat-em-ups to a new level, a whole host of moves including flying kicks, roundhouse kicks, backwards kicks and many more. The game truly is one tough cookie. It was loved by the arcade crowd and likely loved even more for its particular home computer and console conversions. In today's video, we are ranking Renegade from worst to best as requested by many of you over the past couple of weeks. This was my first time of playing the Apple II conversion of this game. I instantly thought that the sprites were looking a little more like zombies. I just couldn't really place my finger on it. Then suddenly zombified Smurfs came to mind. Every now and again in this arcade port series, the 1977 Apple II computer comes along. I will firstly say, as always for these games, for such a dated machine, it was nice that popular arcade games were being ported to it by the late 1980s. But still, come on, this conversion deviates from the source material in many ways. For example, to finish stage 1, instead of everything happening on the subway platform, we firstly have to defeat a few baddies, then walk to the train, fight inside of the train, and then finish off the stage back on the platform where we started to stage 1. One huge noticeable difference besides gangs looking like those zombified Smurfs was the music and sound effects. When too much was happening on screen, and to be fair, not much was happening simultaneously, the music seriously slows down. It's fairly bad as well as the controller response with this port. Input lag was a big issue here for sure. Finally, the color palette used here, well, let's just say Apple II's palette was limited with colors. Firstly, for those not familiar with the Thomson M05, this was a French 8-bit home computer produced to compete against the mighty ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 market of the time. This Amiga version, released way back in 1988, isn't a masterpiece, but certainly not great compared with other ports in this video. Firstly, the boss who overlooks his gang's fight is missing here. Normally, you will see him beside the train on stage 1. No music or introduction to the first fight, and very rudimentary sound effects here too. The real annoyance with this version is its awful collision detection. I went to attack enemies several times, and it just seemed to miss them entirely. I also found that the controller seemed very sluggish when pulling off moves with this game. It's much like a ZX Spectrum looking game, that monochrome look, but nothing really too fancy. Like I said, it's playable to an extent, but there is much better to come with this video. Firstly, this is one of the only computer ports that multi-scrolls, which scrolls actually surprisingly well. I played this game using the EGA modes with the best sound settings available. Although we didn't get hordes of gangs appear simultaneously, that is to be expected. But to be fair, if computer versions did too much, then frame drops would likely be a problem, and the IBM DOS compatible is no exception here. Having said that, even with just a few baddies to fight before the gang leader joins in to beat you up, the sprites don't move too smoothly. They go from very slow pace to extremely fast, and collision detection with this DOS conversion isn't the greatest either. Color wise, I will just say that starting stage 2 seemed more like an ice rink within colour rather than a dirt road that it's supposed to be. Let's just remember that PC gaming in the 1980s wasn't as great as what it was to become in the 90s. For a Type 2 conversion, this really isn't that impressive. I will praise the music and sound effects though. In most DOS arcade conversions I have covered so far in this series, these have largely been ear-piercing beeper sounds. The Commodore Amiga port of Renegade contains something very noticeable when playing. That 4-bar rock and roll music has been replaced with something almost ungodly. Possibly the developers thought that the music just sounded far too dated for this Amiga game. Who knows? Now on with this conversion, surely a step up, and we generally get all gang members here, which is overwhelming, which was the original arcade game's intention. A gang of chaps thugs is very intimidating, and this is where the game works so well, that life or death scenario. Issue with the Amiga port is largely its bad control mechanics. I have played many versions using just one action button or 2 buttons and have managed to play fairly well, but this port just didn't translate those over too well. Collision detection is also way off here too. For a powerful 16-bit computer from that era, the boss isn't even animated. This isn't a great Amiga game by any means. Not much better than the Commodore Amiga version. I found this Atari ST conversion a little bit more responsive to controls and hit collision detection. Not by much though, to be honest, but just a tiny bit where I ranked the ST port higher up. The music again is different here from the arcade game in most other ports, but I found this music a little bit easier to listen to than the Amiga. Just like most ST games, the gameplay screen is smaller, but having said that, it wasn't overly pixelated like the Commodore Amiga's version. A below average version, when just like Amiga, could have really been a great game. I had high hopes of the Commodore 64 conversion by Imagine being good. It's not a game I played on my C64 growing up, although I did play Target Renegade. The big issue with this port is by far the controller scheme. If you haven't played this conversion, we use a joystick to control the player and a couple of keyboard keys to pull off actions. Is this a good combination? Well, not really. It's the type of game that takes a while to get into with an odd controller setup like this version. Secondly, although this game is fairly smooth to play and sprites move nicely too, it's fairly ugly to look at. Very blocky, that is. Colour wise, fairly dull colours from our American 8-bit computer friends. I am sure that when this released, many kids thought that their joysticks had broken at the time. A while later, just to realise that the keyboard had to be used. Music and sound effects isn't much to boast about, but yeah, definitely playable providing you get used to those horrendous controls. Although the NES conversion by Type 2 directly isn't necessarily an awful game, like we have covered in this video, it is missing a couple of things: the overcrowding of gangs, as well as the boss who waits and observes next to the subway train. We have 3 to 4 baddies to defeat here, and although this one's given a flicker-free presentation with sprites that most NES games had back then, this one just seemed a little bit strange to play. I think to an extent maybe the pace was a little far too fast compared with the arcade games in most other versions I played here in this video. The music itself and sound effects are fairly faithful to the source material. I think overly the Nintendo NES conversion just looked a little too bright and bubbly for a game originally intended to look a little gritty. It's difficult to rank this conversion because in terms of collision detection it's pretty much spot on, and it really controls well too with no input lag. I look at the Sega Master System conversion as a massive upgrade from Nintendo NES version. This port truly is a great game in many respects. It is lovely to play and collision detection is really solid here. Sprites, or tiles as some people refer to them as, used here on the contrary to the NES version looks a little better and just overly feels like it was actually attempting to copy the source material. Of course, just like a couple of other versions here in this video, the Sega Master System also sees us go inside of the subway train to finish stage 1. That being said, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this game, but just as always we're looking for the most accurate to the arcade game here. There is of course other bits and pieces missing here, just like most other versions in this video. I would likely say that this was one of Sega Master System's best beat-em-ups for sure. The Amstrad CPC conversion is damn good, but keep this in mind, we are still looking for arcade excellence, and this port isn't that far from getting first place in this video if I'm honest. Absolutely one of the CPC's best beat-em-ups, without a doubt. It even had a fan-made remake of it just a couple of years back, which improved on an already excellent 8-bit microcomputer game. Before I move on to the winning port, I will note here that by no means was this version and the next version actually easy to decipher which version played the best. This was really tough, although this version in the next platform's version was missing that train fighting segment of the first stage, which of course puts this before the Master System and Nintendo NES ports. If you had the ZX Spectrum version by Imagine back in 1987, you were likely jumping up and down in joy that an arcade game conversion really was this great. The 128K version that I am playing here had it all: the music, sound effects, the looks, and that semi-isometric look to go with it all, just like the arcade original. Where this port really excels is its amazing hit collision detection and actually moving the player around on screen. It really is pretty much faultless here, and pretty much one of the best, if not the very best, Spectrum beat-em-ups ever released during its commercial years. The range of attacks you can pull off with ease is seriously impressive and kind of felt easier to control than the actual real arcade version itself. Of course, we have some folks which will look down on Spectrum games. All I can say is get past his monochrome look and enjoy the game, because it really is that great to play. Sure, it's not full colour, but like most old school gamers will say, it's all about the gameplay after all, and not necessarily about how it looks, if it looks fantastic, that is. I am sure I will have haters with this choice, but just remember, my opinion isn't your opinion, and people are very different with their views with games and rankings. Anyways, that's it for ranking Renegade arcade game ports today. So which version would you have ranked it number 1? So admittedly, this was a really awkward video to judge because the Amstrad and Spectrum versions truly were fantastic 8-bit micro ports. Anyways, which version did you play? Did you play the Commodore 64 version, or was you unfortunate enough to have the Apple II version back in the day? Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.
Welcome to the club.
Continuing with the amazing Outrun, Sega released a sequel which in hindsight was inevitable. The original was an instant arcade hit which many people of my age and older have fond memories of. So what could Sega do to differentiate it? Let's make this ultra fancy and call it Turbo Outrun. Just like the original, Turbo Outrun gives you a Ferrari but a new model to move with the times. The same idea pretty much, with a couple of extra features including an opponent who drives a Porsche, and you can also add upgrades to a Turbo Outrun. I don't personally recall this game being in any arcade I went to as a kid, but do know of its massive popularity. Just a bit of info before I start this video: the Commodore Plus 4 actually had an amazing port of this at the beginning of this year, 2024. I will leave this link in the description so you can check it out and get blown away by this version. Anyways, by popular request, let's rank from worst to best of Turbo Outrun ports. We are kicking off the worst Turbo Outrun home conversion release with this Amstrad CPC game. Alongside different platforms in this video, a few struggle mainly with one irritating issue. It is the size of the Ferrari that you are controlling. It really is just far too big for its own good, and it's very difficult to see what's happening in the road in front of you, and this only gets worse when turning corners with this Amstrad port, where instead of giving the car an angle to see what is happening and where to stop braking, the annoyance of the car continues obscuring more of the road in front of you, making it very difficult to judge what's around. Using boost really feels like you are not going any faster. The Amstrad version is very slow paced, very laggy that is, and lacks a sense of speed. No sound effects with this version, and the controlling isn't best either. The 1990 ZX Spectrum version is a tough play. I wouldn't necessarily that it was shockingly bad, but did seem like a downgrade from the original Outrun game for the ZX Spectrum. The main issue is with this port is, again, the size of the car, just like the Amstrad version. It is just far too big to see incoming cars. The depth of the road is also hard to judge here too, as you can only see so much of it. For Spectrum colours, it's not actually that bad. I have certainly seen much worse. Controller wise, this game responds fairly nicely with smooth steering. In terms of speed itself and using boosts, it just doesn't give the player much sense of a wow factor, as in you're speeding like lightning with this version. The music is however superb with this release. If it wasn't for the size of the car, or maybe if the angle of the car and track was adjusted, this, just like the Amstrad version, could have been so much better. Next up, we have got the Atari ST port. You are likely thinking this game looks pretty good. Its colours are fairly vibrant and the music and sound effects aren't bad too. This is sadly where it ends though. Controlling just seems stiff and its frame rates are fairly poor here too. I found myself crashing a hell of a lot with this conversion due to laggy frames like I said, and fairly bad controls too. It's a real shame that the Atari ST ended up with this, as some will likely consider it as a half-finished game. Likely time constraints, and as we know that in those days publishers wouldn't really give much of a care in the world if the final product was this bad and your publishing name happened to be US Gold. To be honest with you, the Commodore Amiga version isn't too much better than the ST conversion. It looks slightly nicer than the ST port and also seems a tiny little bit more responsive, but it still isn't really much fun to play. The issue with the conversion is partly the size of other cars, which make you crash and are very hard to take over other cars whilst you're racing. The music quality is a notable step up from the Atari ST Sport, but really it just lacks what Turbo Outrun is, that sense of speed and good precision when turning corners. Another half-baked port by US Gold. Although the IBM PC compatible DOS port is actually playable and doesn't particularly suffer with frame issues like the previous versions we've looked at, there isn't really much speed involved with this version. It's fairly slow in that the Ferrari is performing like an old school Skoda. It's just very boring to play, and even with the speed boost it's just far too slow. The dashboard on the bottom of the screen really takes away that arcade feel about it, which is trying to imitate. Not particularly a high octane racer at all. I think one of the worst things with the DOS port is that we have no music, just some sound effects, but to be fair, these actually aren't too bad for a DOS game of this era. The Commodore 64 pretty much nailed it as far as 8-bit computers are concerned here. Notably, we have full screen as well as full colour, a nice soundtrack by the awesome Jerome Tell being powered by the best sound chip of that era, which is of course the SID chip. We also have a nice field of view with the C64's conversion, where we can see the road a little bit better through its perspective, rather than being obscured by a car which is clearly too big for its own good. The C64's car sprite size is adequate too here. In terms of controlling, this turns left and right just like butter spreading, and boosts actually feel like you're boosting for a reason here. The sense of speed is definitely here with the Commodore 64's conversion, although maybe a little too fast when braking corners. The Sega Mega Drive's 1992 release is a very fast and responsive conversion. Although not quite arcade perfection in terms of how it looks, the sense of speed and distance depth is pretty nicely implemented here. It is nice and colourful, and taking corners and using boosts all feel very nicely done too. Music wise, it's very nice, and it's of course very Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis sounding, which just comes with that territory. The road ahead is nice to see here, where many other versions spelled with this. The Ferrari you are driving is also a decent size too. Overall, a very good Mega Drive Turbo Outrun conversion, but, and surprisingly, it was developed by the infamous Teratex. If you've seen some of the shoddy work they have done outside of this conversion, you'll note here why I actually said infamous. The next conversion in this video nails it even better than this version though. And in first place we have the 1989 FM Towns conversion, easily winning this war between the ports. In terms of looking very similar to the source material, although it does miss objects and buildings on the sides of the road, this conversion plays very similar and even has an enhanced sound to the game too. I found that as great of a port the Mega Drive had, the FM Towns colours just seemed that much nicer, and controlling just seemed a little bit more refined than the Mega Drive version. A nice pace with this version indeed, and it wasn't designed to make you crash over and over again like some versions did for this arcade game. I really do think that this version is very likely the next best thing you would have had outside the arcade game back in the day. And that's it for today's Ranking Turbo Outrun ports. So did you agree with my FM Towns decision being in first place, or would you have rather had the IBM PC compatible version in first place? Which platform did you play this game on in a day? Let us know as always in the comments below, and until next time, thanks for watching. Yesterday, I asked my community which arcade ports video they'd like to see next in this series, and unsurprisingly, this 1989 run-and-gun arcade game by Data East got the most votes. Surprisingly, in terms of arcade conversions, Midnight Resistance didn't have as many as other popular arcade games of the time, but to be honest, most of these home conversions aren't half bad. Some a little different in terms of presentation, but generally a decent bunch. It is also a rare occurrence for Ocean Software, who published the home computer ports and do a good job with all of them rather than half-finished or totally unplayable games, minus one particular conversion, which we'll cover in this video. So the game itself, a side-scrolling run-and-gun game where you play a member of a resistance movement in a dystopian world, a little bit like modern times. Consider this a simulation of real life today. Anyways, from worst to best, here is Midnight Resistance arcade port, and Happy New Year. Midnight Resistance on the Amstrad CPC isn't a bad game, and certainly not as terrible on the Amstrad CPC as some other arcade conversions were. The general issue here compared with others is a small gameplay screen and fairly sluggish frame rates when moving. Surprisingly, the coders have almost used a monochrome look, which is a shame considering Amstrad could pull off some really nice colours compared with other 8-bit microcomputers of this era. The layout of this version is very slightly different from the arcades game, but not so different that it stands out majorly. There is no music here, but just sound effects. I particularly like the sounds of explosions with this version. Controller wise, it controls really well, and moving the gun around in different directions is done really nicely too. Just a real shame about those low frame rates from time to time. This can make the game a little difficult to play, to be honest. Ocean did a tremendous job with the ZX Spectrum version. In ways, it kind of is similar to the Amstrad's version in terms of its colours used, but unlike Amstrad, the ZX Spectrum was acceptable to be used in this type of colour scheme. The gameplay area is much bigger, and scrolls and controls much nicer too. This version contains both music and sound effects, and they are really nicely done here. There is some slight frame drops here and there, but again, considering this is a Spectrum game with a fair amount happening on screen all at once, this is absolutely impressive stuff. I really cannot knock this version, much as it really is faithful to the 1989 Date original. If I really wanted to be nitpicky, I could say that the sprites used are more of a cartoon style, but even then that would be stupid because the sprites look so nicely detailed, even if they do look different to the other versions in this video. Now, as much as this is an issue and it could be adjusted with display settings, the Commodore Amiga conversion actually came with a palette color bug, which meant that by default the display looked very dark. I did not mess with the video settings as we are showcasing how games looked originally, and this is likely the issue you may have had back in the day where you had to adjust your monitor or your TV. Looks wise, despite that annoyance, it controls and looks good, resembling the 1989 arcade Date game really nicely. Music is fairly good here too, but no sound effects, which is a little irritating considering this is after a 16-bit home computer port. Everything controls nicely here, and not much going wrong in terms of frame drops either. The music in the next conversion truly blows the socks off this Amiga conversion though. It's truly a shame that this version had the color palette bug, otherwise this would have clearly ranked much higher. The Commodore 64's conversion is a decent arcade port, really enjoyable to play and barely struggles with frame rate drops. A couple of occasions this was the case, but nothing too overwhelming which rendered the game unplayable. This one really is nice to control, and pointing your weapon in all angles is very nicely implemented here too, very smooth. It's obviously got a full screen but lacks sound effects. However, where music is concerned, Keith Tinman's soundtrack to the game is top notch without a doubt, as generally was the case with 8-bit computer games where Commodore 64 was concerned. Something else missing here is scrolling into the first mission on the Jeep. Most kids likely had this with their Commodore 64 Night Moves pack back in the day and were very much chuffed with it by what I've read with online reviews. It really is a great port of this game. Next up, we have the Atari ST conversion. Now, some of you new to my channel could argue that, of course, 16-bit conversions are always going to be better than little 8-bit conversions, but really this isn't the case. Many 8-bit versions have been better than 16-bit games in the past on my channel, but here this is a case where the Atari ST version is slightly better in terms of how it looks anyways. It is a slightly smaller screen rather than full screen, which is acceptable as many ST games output this anyways. Now again, the all-important thing is how well does the sprite move around and respond. Well, flawlessly really. The colours used here are a little dull, but we are talking about a war zone, so it's hardly going to be looking like Disneyland anyways. In first place, we have the 1991 release for the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis. Although a tad bit on the difficulty side, the game looks great and sounds brilliant too. Is it the best running gun game for the Mega Drive? Well, probably not. That would likely be handed over to Gunstar Heroes. However, in the context of this video, it most definitely is the best of the bunch. A nice feature with this release is the option menu where you can actually change the difficulty level too. However, I left this to default and the difficulty level was, like I say, fairly challenging. Some versions of this game either had just sound effects or music only, or a small gameplay screen, or a colour bug. I think the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis release deserved top spot here, because rather than coders negotiating with what to remove for the sake of saving space, this version added pretty much everything here where other versions didn't. And that's it for ranking the Midnight Resistance arcade ports today. So, like I say, generally we got a really good bunch just here, and Ocean surprisingly did a good job on all of them, just that Amiga port. But anyways, let us know in the comments which your favourite version of Midnight Resistance was back in the day. Did you have it on Commodore 64? Anyways, thanks for watching and have a good 2025. Released with the name Shadow Warriors for Europe and in Japan as Ninja Ryokenden, or more widely known as Ninja Gaiden, this Tecmo 1988 release was likely in your collection at some point during childhood. This game was a huge deal in its day and was the first of its franchise to spawn many sequels. Let me start with this. Shadow Warriors or Ninja Gaiden has two very different versions. The NES game, for example, was a side-scrolling platformer. Why? Because that was the times the Nintendo was a bit strange like that. So this is the worst of best ports for the arcade original game, which was the full-on side-scrolling beat-em-up. If you have only been used to knowing about the Nintendo NES version, which is fairly likely, this video is going to blow your mind. Where do I start with this god-awful Commodore 64 conversion? Well, just look at it. It's pitiful to look at and even worse to play. This was a game I had as a kid on the re-release Hit Squad label. Did I like it back then? No. I pretty much thought it was just as ridiculous as I do playing it for this video. Let's talk about hit collision detection. This means when a sprite touches something, it detects it and creates something from it. In other words, when I hit a baddie, the baddie is supposed to stop. Not with the C64 Shadow Warriors, you don't. Enemies will walk through you like you weren't there, like you're just some sort of ghost. And this even happens when they're beating you up and you're beating them up. It's just a mess. The enemy sprites are just plain ugly, over-pixelated, and more suited for, say, a 1982 C64 game rather than this 1990 trash promotion. The arcades game gives you weaponry upgrades, but not here. The arcades game feels fun to play. Definitely not here. The arcades game gives you in-game music. Again, not here. The game is likely the worst fighting game on the C64, likely right next to Highlander. I am not exaggerating. For those who had this game originally will know what I am talking about, and I am not even going to talk about the cassette loading times for this game. The game is very ugly and colours are washed out. If you enjoyed this game once, I would be questioning your sanity. We all play games for fun, or that's how it should be. They are part of the entertainment industry. Then we have the Amstrad CPC conversion. This game is not fun for many reasons. Firstly, it doesn't scroll, and so when we move to the right hand side, you could potentially have a few baddies waiting for you, and once they punch you, you will pause with no other option than to wait for them to punch you so many times that you die. Collision detection isn't as horrific as the C64 port, and there was at least some thought at some point put into this, at least where colours and sprites were concerned. A massive improvement over the shoddy C64 conversion, but that's not very hard. A nice addition to this conversion is objects will explode when positioning baddies behind objects or in front of objects and kicking them into those objects. Like I say, there has at least been a little bit of thought put into this conversion. The real big issue with the Amstrad CPC conversion, besides a couple of other things, is that sprites will move like bats out of hell. Possibly the only version of this game where the player's head looks like a Lego head. Firstly, this is a multi-scorer and we can now see enemies coming. Even though this Spectrum version is difficult, no in-game music here, but sound effects aren't too bad. One feature I did like with this port is the ability to swing on poles to bash into enemies. Collision detection can be hit or miss here. It's definitely not wonderful, but the best so far in this list. Sadly, just like a couple of other conversions, once a baddie starts beating on you, you have to stand there and take it like a Lego head. You cannot maneuver out of this at all. Spectrum's port isn't the best, but much more playable than the Commodore 64 or CPC versions. The IBM PC compatible version, which released as Ninja Gaiden back in 1989, is kinda like Micro Machines in scale. It comes with the typical excruciating beeper music which halts when sound effects kicks in. In terms of colour, it's very nicely done, and although it does look very different from other versions, it's not bad for a DOS game of this time. We get crashes and explosions too when enemies or the player gets hit into objects. It's not particularly much to brag about, but a slight upgrades from the 8-bit microcomputer conversions. The Atari ST conversion is a step in the right direction here. Although it's far from perfect, we have typical 8-bit sounding music, and the layout of the game and the sprites are all fairly well put together. The issue with the Atari ST port is, firstly, it's not multi-scrolling. Secondly, it struggles to run at full speed, especially when too much is happening during gameplay. This can cause some annoying frame drops. Music cuts out a tad when action is taking place, which reminds me of the DOS version of this game. Just like the Amstrad CPC port, without multi-scrolling, it can make it difficult when walking to the next screen and you are suddenly confronted with a bunch of enemies waiting to attack you. It's not the worst of these conversions, but like I say, a step in the right direction of getting that real arcade feel. It's not every day that you'll find an 8-bit portable system, especially the Atari Lynx, which has a superior game compared with microcomputers, but the Atari Lynx totally rocks it with its version of Shadow Warriors. And guess what? It might come as a surprise, but Ocean did not publish it, and that's why we have a fairly good version here, which was actually published by Atari at the time of its 1991 release. So what is included here? Well, pretty much a very comprehensive and very faithful portable version of the arcade game, only on a smaller screen with a much lower resolution. It sounds great with its music and combined sound effects. Collision detection actually feels fairly decent here. Enemies and characters in general look like the source material and not blocks of pixelated mess. Multi-scrolling is pretty top notch here, and we can even see smashing enemies into objects, which looks pretty cool with this version. This is very likely to be one of the Lynx's best games. It even comes with a nice introduction to the game too. We'll make a note here that Atari decided to call this version Ninja Gaiden rather than Shadow Warriors. And in first place, the Commodore Amiga's 1989 Ocean conversion is actually a really damn good one. It looks really nice and plays nicely too, with some almost arcade accurate collision detection here. Sure, there is no in-game music, but the high quality sound effects and even added voice synth makes up for all this. Sometimes for conversions of arcade games, something needs to be sacrificed to make room for floppy disk space. The Amiga port actually felt like I was playing a good beat 'em up. Everything from the fancy introduction animation, objects, explosions is very high quality, and you can even get away from harm rather than standing static and taking it until you die. I am very confident that Amiga owners would have been truly laughing at the poor 8-bit computer owners versions back in the day. And that's it for my Shadow Warrior stroke Ninja Gaiden ranking the port. So would you like me and that truly diabolical Commodore 64 conversion, or was you lucky enough to have it on the Atari Lynx or the Commodore Amiga? As always, let us know in the comments, and until next video, thanks for watching.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
I have had a ridiculous amount of requests to cover the different ports of the 1985 Sega Smash arcade hit, which is Space Harrier. So in true Just Jamie fashion, I have honoured the request, and dear lord, likely to the volume of Pac-Man or Space Invaders conversions, Space Harrier likely isn't far behind with its home conversions. What made this game impressive then? Well, for a 1985 game, the arcade game was ridiculously impressive with its third-person perspective and 3D style visuals, complete with gorgeous colours and backdrops and its truly smooth gameplay. The game itself used Sega's Hang-On engine, which actually released a few months prior to this game. It is a unique game and nothing like it is really compared to it since. It's also a very early example of the rail shooter genre. Space Harrier was one of the first arcade releases to use 16-bit graphics in scaled sprite super scaler technology that allowed pseudo 3D sprite scaling in very high frame rates. Yes, this truly was something epic at the time of its release. So today we are ranking from worst to best home conversions. If I miss out a particular system, I truly apologise, but I've done my best to get everything I can for this video. So here we go. During the recording process of playing these old games, from time to time I do get frustrated with games from being just so ridiculously and unnecessarily difficult. Welcome to the Amstrad CPC 1986 Elite conversion. Firstly, this conversion obviously shows enemies and even obstacles in vector style. My issue and frustrations with this version is the trees in particular. Not sure if it was me, but these things were just everywhere and they just seemed almost unavoidable at times, which meant frequent crashes and angry middle-age outbursts, dare I say it. Secondly, the pace of this just doesn't seem to sit right. On one hand, it appears slightly laggy when moving Harry around on screen, and enemies just seem overly fast, which makes it even more difficult to shoot and destroy them. I don't think much of this version, it was really just awful. One thing it does have is a fairly decent 8-bit rendition of the music and some sound effects. I would also like to know why this game reminded me of a football field as I was travelling through the stages. The ZX Spectrum's 1986 Elite conversion is impressive for its attempt with Space Harrier at a technical level, and this is also running with the 48K Spectrum, which is super impressive for the year of this release too. One thing with this port is the immense difficulty level though. As lovely as the 3D effect looks and scrolls really smoothly, the enemy sprites can at times be fairly difficult to see, as many are outlined in black on the first stage, which then clashes with the distant mountains of that same colour. The floor levels in the game will also have enemies appear with blue outlines, which then clash with the blue lining, which acts as the 3D depth effect. There is no music, which is understandable given this being an early Spectrum 48K release. Sound effects are typical for ZX Spectrum here. Like I say, for somebody to code it on this platform and give it such a nice fluid control scheme too, it's very impressive stuff. Just a real shame about the colour clash, which boosts that difficulty level. Make no doubt about it, the only reason this IBM PC compatible conversion is actually here isn't because it's great. In fact, it's damn right awful. It is placed here because the only thing it has got going for it is the colours and sprites used. Playing the game itself is the most boring rail shooter on DOS that I've ever played. Let me explain. The really awful beeper music pulls you into a coma for around 40 seconds of playing it. The sprites move so slowly, then all of a sudden you are hit with a sudden bit of speech synth which says ow. You then snap out of the coma through being woken up through its extreme loudness, and the process repeats itself again. On a serious note, Sega released this port back in 1989, and honestly, what on earth were they thinking? The gameplay element is just shockingly bad here. I have honestly played faster LCD games than this when I was a kid. Although this PC-88 conversion by Dempa, released in 1988, looks a little strange and we have blocks here instead of sprites, this game is incredibly smooth to play, and the music is the icing on the cake here. To complement it even further, it even has really awesome voice synth with it too. We even have a floor here which gives us that speed effect. It controls beautifully too, no doubt about it. This version for the NEC PC-88 or NEC PC-88 is definitely worth a try if you've not tried this one yet. For Commodore 64 users, we actually had two different versions of Space Harrier, one for the European market and one for America. So here we will take a look at the European release by Elite. It's the best of the bunch so far in this list. It moves nicely and Harry controls nicely too. No frame drops, and colours are typical C64 colours, which are slightly dull compared to other colour palettes used in different systems. Now, the C64 isn't a strong point for 3D games, admittedly, with my past experience over the years of playing many of its games. So to have this Euro version running so nicely is a real big bonus here. Its music and sound effects are really nicely implemented too. The problem with this version is that it is just far too fast for its own good. Something else to consider here is the dullness of the floor part of the game. There isn't really any detail there to enhance that we are travelling at a quick speed. This American release by Mindscape was a much better experience than the C64's European release. Firstly, the speed was toned down here, where it just seemed easier to shoot at enemies and avoiding oncoming obstacles, which was much easier to avoid. We still have the superb music here and sound effects, which is the same as the European version. You'll also notice that this Mindscape release also has a floor that illustrates really nicely that you are moving, rather than having that boring static grey colour that Elite gave us with the European release. It's really nice and responsive to play, and I'm pretty certain that this would have easily been the best of the 8-bit microcomputer ports of Space Harrier. This Atari ST release is surely getting closer to looking like the classic 1985 game for sure. In terms of travelling and that speed depth perception, it's a step up for sure from most of the micro 8-bit conversions. The problem is with this conversion, it's firstly poor frame rates, which can obviously give you a hard time. Even when playing the easiest of games, frame rates mean everything from time to time. Something I couldn't grasp here is either Harrier was too big in this version, and so projectiles were very difficult to see coming, or the enemies shooting at you were too small. Something just didn't seem right with sizes with this Atari ST port, and I did find myself dying a hell of a lot with this version too. The NES or Famicom conversion, which released back in 1989, isn't a bad attempt at all. Yes, it suffers with frame drops occasionally, but a damn sight better than the Atari ST Slug Race. This game is very playable. It's a nicely presented game that plays really nicely too, with good tight controls that respond well. Of course, it is cut down to some extent. An example is that we aren't bombarded with trees everywhere like most other conversions had. The music and sound effects are fairly satisfactory from an 8-bit gaming console. Like I say, it's a polished looking game, but sadly just suffers with frame drops every now and again. Something that I did actually enjoy with this version was watching enemy crafts flying in the line in the distance. Something about this particular version just seemed nicer to watch that happening. Of course, that could be the colours used, which made it stand out much more than other versions. There were two versions of Space Harrier for the Sega Master System, this version and the 3D version, which was actually the sequel to it. This is an impressive and very faithful conversion of the source material for what it is actually working with hardware-wise. Let's just remind ourselves that generally, home conversions normally have sacrifices such as particular game elements missing in order to make games run smoother. This version does admittedly have some slight frame drops, but not as bad as the NES conversion, and both of these are both 8-bit consoles. It's a very responsive game in terms of controlling Harry, and the speed is just right, as well as sizing of tiles or sprites, however you like to refer to them as. I was actually surprised to see that the dragon at the end of stage 1 was huge compared with the other versions. The use of colours in this version was really nicely used too. It's a nice and bright looking game for sure. This really was worth buying a Sega Master System for way back in 1987. I will note here that there wasn't much point including the Sega Game Gear conversion, as this was pretty much the same as this Sega Master System release, but only on a smaller screen of course. Next up, we have the 1988 release of Space Harrier for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16, which in my opinion is an upgrade from the Sega Master System conversion. This release contains no frame drops from what I played, no sprite flickering in enemies, and their bullets don't look like tiles either, which is kind of what the Sega Master System and Sega Game Gear seems to look like. This is a solid and very fluid playing conversion, and everything here just feels right. As we know so far, sizes of sprites are everything with this game. Otherwise, things are hard to see or even to shoot at. The music and sound effects here are great too, and if I'm honest, a slightly bit easier version of the game. Though we will always have a battle between Amiga and Atari ST fans, which one was best, but seriously, regardless of which platform you side with, it is undoubtable that this Commodore Amiga conversion won this battle with this particular game. A full screen for starters, and extremely fluid gameplay scoring, which truly emulates that feeling of travelling and speed. Enemies and projectiles, as well as Harry himself, all seem to be scaled correctly, so it did not appear that either sprites were too big or too small. A superb rendition too of the arcade game with some really nice voice in favour of that. It's not particularly over pixelated, it looks that much smoother when looking at shapes of Harry and enemies up close. The Amiga conversion truly is a great port, and many would have loved this release back in the day.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
When it comes to arcade perfection, many Sharp X68000 games pretty much were, but this truly wasn't the case for Space Harrier. Sure, the game looks stunning, and after all, it's coming from a complete powerhouse of a machine. Although this is a great port in its own right, I was actually surprised to find this really struggling at times with frame rate drops, and dealing with lots of sprites on screen simultaneously made this happen. We can set this up with sound effects only, or music and sound effects. I personally chose sound effects, and sure enough it all sounded really awesome, including some voice synth too. Music wise is nicely done here too, but really I am astonished that the best overall arcade conversion wasn't for the Sharp X68000. Let me make this clear, there's nothing wrong at all with this port, but we are still looking for arcade perfection, which means a system that could support the game rather than have annoying slowdowns.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Although the Sega 32X was technically a flop from Sega, it's undeniable that it had some extremely good games, and Space Harrier here was no exception. This conversion was released in 1994 and published directly from Sega themselves. It's extremely close to the source material, but again, I did experience some very minor lag in the game when several things were going on at any one given time. Not as bad as the Sharp X68000's port could be, and frankly not a complete deal breaker, because this is really a solid game, which in my opinion even sounds better than the 1985 game that is imitating. We also have less pixelation here with enemy sprites as they come close up to the screen, so not necessarily rough edges, everything's pretty smoothed out here. Again, difficulty level is toned down here, which makes it much more enjoyable to play too. The entire layout of the game, including floor colours, are pretty much identical to the arcade game itself.
You're doing. Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
I am pretty confident that the Sega Saturn's version is the very next best thing to the arcade's original release. Everything is here, everything is almost identical, and the thing that ranks this conversion in first place is its total lack of frame drops, where many other versions in this video had that issue or a very slight issue. The power of Saturn truly nailed this game. This was released as a standalone game in Japan, and for the rest of the world it came bundled with the Sega Ages Volume 1 disc.
Get busy, Harrier. Dragonland is screaming.
And finally, as an honourable mention, we have the PlayStation 2 conversion. I chose not to rank this incredible version in the main rankings because although this is likely my favourite port out of everything here, the idea of this series is to rank the versions which mostly resembles the arcade game. The PlayStation 2 version is clearly a reimagining or modernising the source material to give it a modern feel. The enemies are rendered in 3D here. The floors and sky colours of the game are a little more realistic looking. Given at this point in history, millions of more colours were available to create a better look if needed. Harry even enters the stage differently here, where he enters from the right hand side and zoomed into. It's a very impressive version of Space Harrier, and I totally recommend this one. And that's it for today's ranking various Space Harrier ports. So like I said at the start of the video, if I missed out a particular version, I'm truly sorry and it wasn't done on purpose. So which port of Space Harrier did you have growing up, or as a young adult, or whatever age you was at the time? Which version did you enjoy most, and did you actually agree with Sega Saturn being in first place? Anyways, until next video arrives, thanks for watching. Bomb Jack is a 1984 single-screen platformer by Tecmo, a superb and brightly coloured arcade game with some of the most cheery music you'll hear from a game in this genre, especially if you happens to be a Beatles fan with its sound of Lady Madonna. The premise of the game is to simply jump and glide around each stage and collect bombs. It's essentially a point-scoring game, and of course games of this age were generally about gaining huge sums of points to get you the best score against your friends. It's one of the best platformers of the 1980s and without a doubt a massive success too. I've had tons of people asking me to cover this one for a little while now because it truly is that well loved. So in traditional form of this ports ranking series, we are going to start with the worst and gradually work to the best. If you are new to this series, I'll leave my arcade ports playlist pinned in the comments section so you can catch up. The Bomb Jack released for the Commodore Plus 4 and Commodore 16 is fairly bare bones and a little wooden to control if I'm honest. There is no music, but a couple of rudimentary sound effects, which doesn't really resemble an arcade sound as such. It released in 1986 by Elite. Arcade conversions for the Plus 4 and 16 were in their minority really, but to be frank, it's not a terribly awful conversion, just very limited to what it can and can't do. For example, in the arcades game, we'll frequently see things to collect on screen, things flashing and other bits and pieces. What you see here is pretty much what you get. There has been much worse for Commodore Plus 4 and the Commodore 16 machines, Ghosts and Goblins for example, which I've covered in the past. For a very basic version of Bomb Jack, it's kind of fun to play. One thing that I did notice, which was a little bit annoying, was jumping through gaps. I will also mention that most other versions, just like the 1984 arcade game, had a change of backgrounds per stage. Not with this version though. Like I say, it was kind of wooden to control jack from time to time, but like I say, not really a bad conversion at all, just extremely basic. I had high hopes for the Commodore 64 conversion. A lifelong C64 fan cannot be biased though, and I never am in these videos, but I am ranking this port so low down in the list because at the core of it, it just isn't really that great. Firstly, the gameplay screen isn't right. By that I mean the sprites and the enemies just seem way too big, and many times playing this I found that jumping over enemies can normally cause an instant death, where there isn't much room to jump over them. It is very pixelated too, admittedly. The music isn't too bad, but doesn't really resemble the source material too greatly. A real shame with this version, it is just overly clunky to play, and at times I even found that platforms kind of merged in with the background colours far too often, which caused a few deaths too. This ZX Spectrum 1986 conversion is a damn fine one. Yes, it is a ZX Spectrum game and its colours aren't for everybody's taste, but considering everything else here with the gameplay and layout of the stages, this is where the Spectrum excels ahead of its main 8-bit counterparts, i.e. the Commodore 64. This is a very roomy game, which means it isn't too cramped and can generally have a good time with this conversion. It has no music and sound effects are pretty basic. But push those aside, not every conversion had music anyways, and if it did, it wasn't really copying the music of the arcade game, with just a couple exceptions in this video. This was a lot of fun to play and felt like a real high quality Spectrum game considering the release of this title too. It's fairly impressive with its use of physics when jumping and landing. The Amstrad CPC was a fairly good conversion of Bomb Jack released back in 1986. It plays really nicely and has good controls. For example, when I am pressing fire button, Jack slowly guides downwards and it feels like it was nicely done here too with the gliding aspect of things. We have all the usual stuff here, such as invincibility collectibles and changes of background. The game itself is fairly colourful too. I have seen some really shoddy Amstrad conversions during this series, and Bombjack really does a fantastic job on the Amstrad CPC. One thing that it doesn't have is music, but we do have sound effects, and those are pretty high standards too, really. Sure, the text on the right hand side is kind of pixelated, but that's acceptable to some extent given its age and hardware. I would have thought Amstrad users who only had a green screen at the time would have been really annoyed to realise how nicely coloured this conversion was. Sprite collision detection is pretty spot on here too. Not many of you were likely expecting a mere original Game Boy conversion to be this high up, but here we are. And you know what? This version is pretty damn good too. This conversion released in 1992 by Infogrames and does everything right, apart from the monochrome colours of course. But that aside, everything else is really here. The gameplay area is nicely spread out, which allows us room to jump around the screen without danger of accidentally bumping into enemies. The pace of the game is amazingly good. It is fairly speedy in terms of sprites. As for the sprites themselves, they are excellently drawn and it just generally felt like a good solid port all round. Yes, the music isn't right either, but we do get changes of background which adds to the experience, like we are actually getting further into the game itself. You can even choose to enable music with this too, so your parents can complain too much for that repeating 8-bit sound loop. Firstly, remember what you see here is emulation, and from time to time games appear to run slightly higher speed, and that's what has happened here with the Amiga's conversion of Bombjack using WinUAE. This conversion is known to play slow. Its version I used to play back in the day is not absolutely terrible, but it's playable. It is originally just slow in terms of movement though, but I always found it acceptable to play back then. It certainly looks the part with its colours and backdrops, but I can guarantee you the next platform is light years ahead of this. There is a remake of this game for Amiga which has cleaned it up. I won't mention or rank it here, but we'll be showcasing it in my unofficial arcade port sub-series at some point soon. Now, the strange thing with the 1985 NEC PC 88 conversion by SoftBank Corp is that it sounds so damn good. By far best sounding version here, which sounds next best to the arcade game itself. It does music and sound effects proud without a doubt. The game itself is colourful and certainly playable, but it does suffer with sprite flicker with Jack himself. Like I say, it is absolutely playable, but not as fluid as some conversions in this video. I rated this one so highly because it looks great and it certainly plays well, providing you get along with slower paced games. I think this is a great port, but could likely be a controversial place to put this one in this video. You likely weren't expecting to see a Sega SG-1000 game this high up in this video, but damn, this is one awesome port. Now, admittedly, we don't have the vertical and centralized ratio here, but neither does most other versions, if I'm honest. What is it about this conversion which is actually so good? Well, firstly, unlike most ports in this video, the music is actually almost there with this version. It's not perfect by any stretch, and I obviously think the NEC PC 88 did the best job of that. I am guessing at this point that the Beatles music couldn't be produced for copyright reasons, and that's just it, I guess. The Sega SG-1000 version plays so nicely and just feels really fun whilst playing it. And in first place, we have the Atari ST conversion. Now, I love this version of Bomb Jack on the Atari ST. Not the gameplay as much as the music, which is just amazing. It's the first time I've ever played this version, and the music is just so nicely done, and likely one of the best tunes I've ever heard on the Atari ST. Firstly, it skews the gameplay footage. At this point, my controller was going a little bit mental. I have looked this up to see if this was an issue with the game itself, but no report, so it was quite likely my controller. So as we can see, the game looks fantastic, especially those colours, and the sound effects are really nicely done here too. This 1988 port hasn't really got much bad to say about it. It plays relatively really well. The original arcade game is a complete vertical screen centralised, so if there was any criticism, this would be it. But to be fair, every version of this video hasn't had that true arcade gameplay ratio size. And that's it for today's ranking the Bomb Jack port. So as always, let me know in the comments which version you grew up with, and do you necessarily agree that Atari ST deserved to be in first place just there, or would you have rather had the Commodore Amiga version in first place? And as always, until next time, thanks for watching.